This week in digital photography, we'll be taking a deep dive as we get into the nitty-gritty of lighting in the studio. We'll take a look at different light sources that we can use, as well as some of the basic lighting patterns that are commonly used in portraiture. Studio lighting can be incredibly diverse, ranging from a single continuous light source to as many as 5 or more studio strobe lights. In this video, we'll talk about different lights typically found in a photo studio, as well as some of the basic lighting patterns, whether you're using one light or many lights. Each light source will be carefully placed, modified, and adjusted to provide the perfect light to fit your need. Before we get started, let's familiarize ourselves with some of the terms that you may hear throughout this video and while reading or watching videos related to studio lighting. The main light is the light that is providing the primary illumination for your scene. If you're using only one light, that light becomes the main light or the key light. They mean the same thing. If you're using more than one light, the main or the key light is generally the brightest and largest source of light on the set. The fill light is a secondary light that is used to fill in some of the shadows. It's generally placed either near the camera position or opposite the main light, where it can throw a little bit of light where the main light can't reach. Background, hair, and kicker lights are all forms of accent lights. These are generally placed to throw light in a very specific place, and they augment the light coming in from the main and the fill lights. A background light is placed to shine light directly onto the background. This is especially helpful if you're photographing a subject wearing dark clothes against a dark background, and allows you to see some difference between the clothing and the background, so the subject doesn't just turn into a floating head on a sea of dark. A hair light is directed at the back of the subject's hair and allows you to get a highlight that is, again, useful when photographing a subject with dark hair against a dark background. And finally, a kicker light is simply a very pointed light source that is designed to kick a little bit of light into a very specific area of the scene. A handheld light meter is simply a device that you can hold where your subject will stand and get a measurement of the light. This is how you'll know what aperture to set your camera for in order to get good exposure. Unfortunately, if you're using speed lights or strobes, the burst of light is too short for the camera's internal meter to read, so you'll either need to use a separate light meter, or simply take a guess, shoot a sample image, and then adjust by visually inspecting the back of the camera. Light modifiers are an entire class of different attachments that photographers can use to change the shape, quality, or spread of light from one of the light sources. We've already discussed a number of different modifiers available for speed lights and strobes in our earlier unit on artificial lighting. Refer back to that video if you need further clarification. Reflectors are shiny fabrics or white cards that can be used opposite of a light source to bounce light back into the subject. Conversely, a scrim or a gobo is a black card or sheet of opaque fabric that blocks light from reaching a particular place in the scene. And finally, a diffuser is simply a transparent fabric that can be placed between the light and the subject to soften the light and provide softer transition from light to dark. Typically speaking, most studio photographers will use one or more of 4 different types of lighting. Natural light photographers rely on large open windows as the primary light source and will frequently modify the light with sheets of fabric in front of the windows, as well as reflectors and scrims around the studio to guide the light just where they want it. Continuous lights, like these fluorescent lights, are sometimes referred to as video lights, as they put out a constant light source that can be seen at all times, which makes them great for photographers who also happen to shoot video. Continuous lights are great for beginners, as you can see exactly what effect they have on the image, and you can move them around until you get the look that you want. There's no need for separate light meters, and you can use your camera as you would outdoors. The biggest drawback for continuous lights is that they just aren't quite as powerful as the speed lights or the strobes. Speed lights, or those add-on flash units that you can mount directly on your camera, can also be used on light stands within a studio. Paired with a remote trigger, these lights can be a relatively inexpensive way to get into studio lighting. Speed lights are more powerful than continuous lights, yet lighter and more portable than big strobe units. You'll need to use either a separate handheld light meter or do some guesswork to get your exposures right in camera. But if you're new to studio lighting, speed lights can be a good way to test the water. Additionally, speed lights are more portable than studio strobes, and if you do shoot in studio and on location, getting a set of 2 or 3 speedlights might be a more versatile plan. And finally, studio strobes are the most powerful setup that you can have for studio lighting work. These workhorse lights are either plugged into a power pack or are connected to a large lithium battery pack and have rapid recycle times and nearly limitless flashes, so you can keep shooting without having to wait for your lights to come back up after each shot. Studio strobes are large, heavy, and expensive, but they also give you the greatest range of modifiers. They generally don't leave the comforts of your studio though, so they're best for photographers who shoot primarily in studio. If you're using artificial light in studio, you're going to need a few basic pieces of gear. First, you'll need a light source, and that could be a strobe, a speed light, or a continuous light source. You're also going to need a way to position that light source where you need it, and that's where a light stand comes into play. Light stands come in a variety of different forms, but ultimately it's an adjustable pole that can be either raised or lowered, and there are legs at the base of that support so that it doesn't just fall over. If you're using a strobe, it'll typically mount directly on top of the light stand. But if you're using a speed light, you'll need an additional piece of gear that can attach to the light stand and provide an articulating base for the speed light to attach to. Typically, these clamps also include a small hole that can accept an umbrella as shown here in the middle image. And finally, you'll need a trigger which attaches to the base of the light or by a cord and is connected wirelessly to a transmitter that is also mounted on the top of your camera. If you are shooting with speedlights or strobes, the duration of the flash is so short that your camera can't meter it accurately. In these situations, you'll be best served by using a handheld light meter and holding it where your subject's face will be. Then pop the lights, and the meter will give you the aperture that you would set your camera at. In studio photography, the shutter speed is largely irrelevant because the exposure is determined by the flash, whose duration is far shorter than any shutter speed you could use. Generally, studio photographers would set for the sync speed of their camera, typically around 1/60th to 1/125th of a second, and then adjust their aperture to control the amount of light that reaches the subject. Both strobes and speedlights can also be adjusted to put out different amounts of light, anywhere from maybe 1/64th power to full power, which can greatly range depending on the light being used. Rembrandt lighting can be used with a single light plus a reflector, or 2 lights. In all of these situations, however, the main light will be set about 45 degrees from the subject and slightly above eye level. If a reflector is being used, it'll be placed on the shadow side of the face to push some light back into the subject. Images shot with Rembrandt light will have a telltale triangle of light from the corner of the nose to the eye, opposite of the main light. In split lighting, we move the light all the way to one side of the subject, and there is very little, if any, light that spills onto the shadowed side. If you use a large diffuser like a softbox, you're more likely to see some detail on the shadow side. Use a smaller light and the shadow will be a pure black. Butterfly and clamshell lighting are essentially the same. In both of these setups, you have a main light that is above and slightly in front of the subject's face, aimed down towards the nose. Typically, images that use this lighting also have the subject facing directly at the camera. Adding the reflector under the chin turns this into clamshell and softens the shadow. The edge definition of the shadow can be modified using a larger or smaller light source. Using a large softbox, the shadow will be nearly imperceptible. Use a very narrow spotlight, and the shadow will have sharply defined edges. The 2-light Rembrandt is the same as the 1-light Rembrandt, but adds a second light at the camera position. This diagram shows a background and a hair light, but these are not always necessary. Rembrandt light is good for slimming the face. Notice that you still have the triangle of light on the shadowed side of the face, but the shadows are much softer now, and we can see the detail in the skin thanks to the second light filling in some of the shadows. Loop lighting falls somewhere between butterfly and Rembrandt. Start with a butterfly setup with a light above the camera aimed down towards the subject, and then move the light slightly to one side or the other until you see a loop of shadow from the corner of the nose. Here we see the small shadow of the nose, but it doesn't extend far enough to the side to connect to the cheek shadow. If it extended to the cheek, then it would be considered Rembrandt. Short and broad lighting are essentially the same idea as a Rembrandt light, but adds a sense of directionality. In short lighting, we turn the subject's nose slightly towards the light so that the light hits the shorter side of the face. This puts more of the face in shadow and slims a heavier face. Conversely, in broad lighting, we turn the subject's nose away from the light, letting the light hit the broader side of the face. Since there's more light on the face, it makes the face look broader than it would if it was straight on. A hair light is just as it sounds. It's another way to give some separation between the hair of your subject and an otherwise dark backdrop. Here, we see the effect of the hair light shining on the left side of her hair, giving it a soft glow. The right side of her hair, without the hair light, is closer to disappearing into the dark background, even though she does have light-colored hair. Background lights are generally aimed at the background to give a sense of separation when using a dark background. Here we see two background lights, but we also see two scrims, or black cards. These are being used to ensure that no light from the strobes is coming back at the camera. In this sample, we also see that these lights have been gelled, meaning that there is a sheet of colored plastic in front of each light to give a color contrast against the dark background. A third light, not shown in the diagram, has also been gelled and provides light to the short side of her face. Notice the color contrast of the blue fill light against the orange background light on the left side of the frame. A kicker light is typically placed behind a subject and adds that extra kick of light to give a rim of lighting around the shadowed side of the subject. This can be a spotlight against the back of the head or an entire strip of light that illuminates the entire side of the subject's body. This week I'll be bringing my entire studio lighting kit to campus and setting up a studio on the 4th floor. I'll be bringing Eliza with me to be our model, and we'll work our way through the basic equipment as well as some of the lighting patterns, and students will have a chance to do some shooting with the model. I'm really looking forward to this unit, and I hope that you'll find it both interesting and rewarding.